The summer of 1997 held northern Minnesota in a strange, unmoving stillness. The days were long and humid, the kind of heat that clung to your skin and made everything feel suspended in time. The forest buzzed with insects, the lakes shimmered with sunlight, and families across Swan County packed up their coolers and fishing rods for weekend escapes. For the Hartley family, it was supposed to be just that, a short, quiet getaway to Echo Pines Lake, a remote, winding stretch of water nestled deep within the Swan County Forest Reserve. Daniel Hartley, 38, was a respected high school science teacher. His wife, Beth, 36, worked part-time at the local library. Their children, Ben, age 9, and Sophie, age 7, were energetic, curious, and inseparable. The trip had been planned for weeks. Daniel had visited the same lake as a child and wanted to share it with his own family. They left early Friday morning in their Chevy Suburban, towing a small aluminum fishing boat. At 10:12 a.m., they checked in at the ranger station. Daniel signed the logbook for campsite number 6, the most isolated spot along the North Inlet. An elderly fisherman recalled seeing them launch their boat just after 11 a.m. He remembered Beth's red scarf fluttering in the breeze and the children giggling as they leaned over the side of the boat. That was the last confirmed sighting. By Sunday evening, when rangers noticed their vehicle still parked at the dock, concern set in. They radioed the family. No response. A full search began Monday morning. Helicopters circled the lake. Divers swept the waters. Tracking dogs were brought in. Nothing. No overturned boat, no floating gear, no footprints, no signs of a struggle. After 5 days of exhaustive searching, the investigation stalled. No clues, no evidence, no leads. It was as if the family had vanished into thin air. Authorities eventually classified it as a probable drowning, a tragic accident in dangerous waters. But with no remains and no wreckage, many in the community remained unsettled. The story faded from headlines. But for some, especially Mara Quinn, the silence never felt like peace. It felt like a secret, one the lake had buried. Mara Quinn had just turned 21 when the call came. It was a warm July afternoon in Duluth, where she was attending college. She was folding laundry in the common room when the dorm phone rang. A deputy patched her through to the sheriff. His voice was direct and unnervingly calm. "Mara, there's been an incident. Your brother and his family, they're missing." She thought she misheard him. Daniel gone, with Beth and the kids? The word missing didn't register. People don't just vanish. Not entire families. Not in the middle of summer. Not on a lake trip an hour from home. Not someone like Dan, who kept emergency flares in his glove box and laminated packing lists for camping. But it was real. Within hours, Mara was back in Swan County, sitting in a folding chair beside her uncle, holding Beth's scarf like it might somehow give her directions. She walked the banks. She helped map out search grids. She slept in her clothes. She stopped eating after day 3. And when the official search was called off, she didn't stop. She stayed another month, hiked the same trails over and over, questioned bait shop owners, hikers, campers, even a boy who'd been skipping stones that weekend. But the answers never came. Eventually, she returned to school, to the motions of life. But something inside her had gone still. She changed her major from journalism to environmental sciences. She wanted to be outdoors, close to the trees, close to silence. She became a park ranger, not for the uniform or the badge, but because being surrounded by woods made her feel less haunted. For 13 years, she worked different districts, kept her head down, and patrolled forests that weren't Echo Pines. She watched strangers enjoy lakes while trying not to hate them for the peace they found in it. At night, she'd sit cross-legged on the floor, sifting through a shoebox filled with fragments. A Hartley family photo, a drawing Ben had done of a dinosaur, a grocery list with Beth's handwriting. The most precious of all was a tiny plastic dolphin charm, once clipped to her keyring by Sophie. "So you don't get lost," Sophie had said. She still carried it. Then one morning in April 2010, Mara's phone rang. The voice on the other end was steady, aged. "This is Sheriff Halbrook. I think you should come back to Echo Pines."
Why?
They found something. The drought came in April. By early May of 2010, Echo Pines Lake had dropped more than 6 feet, the lowest water level in nearly 70 years. The shoreline crept back like it was retreating in shame, revealing thick mats of tangled reeds, waterlogged trash, and moss-covered stumps that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Locals wandered the exposed lake bed, collecting fishing lures and rusted cans. The lake, once wide and shimmering, now looked like a drained grave. And that's exactly what it turned out to be. On a foggy Tuesday morning, a retired postal worker named Cal Deakins was walking his Labrador along the North Inlet, a narrow, muddy finger of water choked with old logs and brush. The dog began barking near a cluster of rocks, tugging Cal toward a bend where the mud had cracked in sheets. Something metallic was sticking out of the muck. At first, he thought it was a barrel. Then he saw the propeller. He called the local ranger station. By the end of the day, a team of deputies and forensic techs had excavated what remained of a 15-foot aluminum fishing boat, twisted, oxidized, and crushed on one side. The metal was warped inward like it had been intentionally damaged. A faded registration number on the stern confirmed what Mara already feared. Number 614E. The Hartley's boat. Inside the battered hull, technicians recovered 2 children's life jackets, one pink with peeling cartoon fish, the other blue. A cracked thermos with faded tape that still bore Beth's handwriting. The rusted remains of a tackle box. A sandal, purple size XS. A strand of long, light blonde hair caught in the screw hinge under the middle seat. The boat had been entombed beneath layers of silt, roots, and debris. No sonar scan had picked it up over the years. The area was never thoroughly searched. In 1997, the North Inlet had been deemed inaccessible due to fallen timber and beaver dams. The assumption was that nothing and no one could get that far in a boat. They were wrong. The moment Mara saw the photographs, her stomach flipped. This wasn't a tragic accident lost in time. This was intentional concealment. Someone had wanted that boat to disappear. And for 13 years, they had almost succeeded. Mara arrived in Swan County just before sunrise. 13 years had passed, but the smell of pine and damp earth brought everything back, as if time had only paused, not moved on. She drove in silence, passing gas stations with faded signage and cabins that looked half abandoned. The lake shimmered in the distance, low and tired. At the sheriff's office, Renee Halbrook met her outside. They exchanged few words. The weight of the moment didn't need conversation. "I want to see it," Mara said. Renee nodded. The recovered boat sat beneath a gray tarp behind the ranger station, surrounded by caution tape and pine needles. Mara stepped under the rope slowly, like she was approaching a coffin. The vessel was worse than she imagined. Rust lined the hull like veins. The front right panel had collapsed inward. The metal folded as if something, or someone, had crushed it from the outside. Inside, the remnants were still being cataloged. The 2 children's life jackets rested on the stern, side by side. One of them had Sophie's name faintly stitched into the collar. The thermos was cracked down the middle, mud flaking off the lid. Mara spotted something half buried beneath the middle bench. A sandal. Purple, small. She reached out to touch it, then stopped. Her hand hovered just above the strap, trembling. "This wasn't an accident," she whispered. Sheriff Halbrook folded her arms. "No, I don't think it was." Later that afternoon, Mara returned to campsite number 6, the spot Daniel had reserved all those years ago. The fire pit was still there, overgrown but intact, a ring of stones and half-burnt logs. Wind moved through the trees like a voice just out of reach. She knelt and brushed aside pine needles from the old tree stump where Ben once sat eating marshmallows. A piece of fishing line was still tangled in a root nearby. She stood, turning to the narrow trail that led back toward the lake, the same path they would have taken to the boat ramp. The trail was quiet. Too quiet. Back in town, whispers had started again. The Hartley case was resurfacing. People who once offered casseroles and condolences were now exchanging theories at the diner. Some said the boat must have struck a submerged rock. Others hinted at something darker. Debt, jealousy, secrets. Mara ignored them all. She wasn't here for gossip. She was here for truth. And the truth was already bleeding through the surface like the boat from the mud. Mara didn't wait for permission. By the time she woke the next morning, she had already compiled a list of people to talk to. Not suspects yet, just names that had never sat right with her in the original files. She dressed in her ranger field gear, not to play cop, but because the uniform gave her posture, steadiness. She needed both. She started with the person who knew the lake best, Tom Weller, a retired diver who'd assisted in the original search. He was in his 70s now, knee-wrapped in a brace, beard long and gray. He lived in a cabin on the county line and still kept a dive mask hanging by his door. "You look like your brother," he said, leading her inside. Mara hadn't expected that. She blinked but said nothing. Tom poured coffee into chipped mugs and gestured for her to sit. The kitchen smelled like old wood and cigarette ash. "We tried, Mara," he said, voice low. "We really did." "I know," she replied, "but I need to understand what didn't get tried." Tom reached for a drawer and pulled out an old county search map. Creased, torn at the edges, marked in red ink. He spread it across the table. "See this section here?" He tapped the north inlet, the same one where the boat had been found. "We couldn't get sonar in there. Beavers had blocked half the entrance with deadfall. The inlet was too shallow, too choked with logs. We figured, if they were anywhere, it'd be farther out. So this section was never searched?" Tom shook his head. "Not properly. Maybe some guys walked the bank, but no boats, no divers. We just didn't have the manpower." Mara stared at the map. The inlet circled in red like an oversight screaming from the page. Back in town, she went to the archives at the old sheriff's office. The current staff gave her a dusty key and a shrug. "Whatever's down there, you're welcome to it." The basement smelled of mildew and forgotten stories. Metal shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes that hadn't been touched in years. She found the Hartley file quickly. Its tab was still marked open, unsolved. She flipped through crime scene photos, ranger logs, interview transcripts. She noticed something, a gap. No records from July 20th to July 24th, the week after the search began. No updates, no patrol logs, no follow-ups. She walked back upstairs and asked the deputy on duty. He shrugged. "Might have been a filing error. Some of that stuff never got digitized." Mara left the station angry, not at them, at the silence. She stood outside the building and watched the wind move through the trees. If the inlet had never been searched, if key dates had vanished from official records, then what else had been missed? And who had wanted it missed in the first place? Back at the roadside motel, Mara stood over a cluttered desk strewn with documents. Folded maps, photocopied autopsy reports, aging newspaper clippings. The air smelled faintly of mildew and motel bleach, but her senses were fixated on something else. The blue spiral-bound notebook from Daniel's cabin. She hadn't seen it in over a decade. It was buried in a box marked camping gear. Inside were scribbled notes on lake depths, tackle types, and wildlife sightings, typical for her meticulous older brother. But halfway through, the tone shifted. A page torn at the edges listed 4 names. No context, no dates. Just Reiner, das Martin, Carlsbad, Serene, Hoxie, Cedarwood with a sharp line striking it out. Below the names, a set of GPS coordinates. That's all. Nothing else. Mara typed the numbers into her phone. The result made her pause. It didn't point to Echo Pines. It pointed to a region 15 miles northwest, a remote stretch of state forest land, once leased to a now defunct hunting preserve, a place with no current ranger oversight, a place where nobody was supposed to be. Why had Daniel written this? Why these names? The first one gnawed at her, Rayner. Mara tore through the search logs again, flipping until she found what she was looking for. A short entry from 1997, barely 2 paragraphs. Thomas and Linda Rayner from Illinois. Camped at Echo Pines the same weekend Daniel and his family vanished. Their statement had been minimal. Saw the Hartleys at the dock. No contact. Left early Saturday. They were never questioned again. Curious, she searched county records. In late July of 1997, just 2 weeks after the disappearance, the Rayners sold their camper and permanent Minnesota campsite. Days later, they moved out of state to Clearwater, Missouri. Changed their address. Disconnected their number. Too quick, too quiet. Digging deeper, she accessed public DMV archives and printed their ID photos. Middle-aged, average-looking. Nothing suspicious. But the unease was growing. Not from their faces, but from the uncanny sense of distance, of vanishing, just like her family had. The next morning, she drove to the coordinates from Daniel's notes. It was thick forest, the kind that swallowed sound. A rusted chain-link gate blocked the path, adorned with no trespassing signs, faded by decades of rain and sun. The gate had long since been clipped open, a remnant from a forgotten time. She walked. The woods grew denser. Her GPS pinged softly every few steps. The air was colder here, shaded by towering pines. Half a mile in, she found a clearing. In the middle sat a collapsed shack, roof caved in, walls leaning like drunks at a bar. Overgrowth had wrapped around it like claws. She stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath her weight. The air was stale, touched with the scent of old oil and wet wood. On the far wall, under years of moss and pine needles, she spotted something carved into the floorboards. She crouched. 3 words, to scratch, deep and furious. They were here. The message sent a chill up her spine. The handwriting looked frantic, desperate, not the kind of thing someone etches lightly. She snapped photos, marked the location. Her heart was pounding now, not from fear, but from the slow certainty building inside her. Her brother had come here, or someone had, to leave that message. As she turned to leave, her boot caught something metallic beneath the leaves. She brushed it aside. A discarded soda can from the late 90s. The brand had been discontinued years ago. Someone had been here, around the time the family vanished. Someone who wanted this place forgotten. And as Mara stepped back into the woods, she realized something deeper. This wasn't just about a lake anymore. This was deliberate. Someone had tried to bury the truth. And now she was digging it back up. Mara sat in her truck with the heater humming and her hands wrapped tightly around a lukewarm coffee. The photo of the Rainers stared up from her dashboard. Average faces. Her gut screamed otherwise. That night she couldn't sleep. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of water. Not calm lake water, but black, suffocating depths. 2 small hands reached for her, slipping beneath the surface. The sound of children's laughter turned to choking. She jolted awake, her shirt damp with sweat, her chest aching. 13 years of silence, and still they haunted her. The next morning she drove to the edge of town to speak with someone she'd avoided for years. Mrs. Lockett, who had lived 2 cabins down from her brother in 1997. A chain-smoking widow with sharp eyes and a memory like a trap. "I knew they didn't just drown," the old woman muttered, offering Mara a seat on the front porch. Something wasn't right. That night, there was shouting. Mara leaned forward. Shouting from where? From the cove. Around midnight. I was up, couldn't sleep. Heard voices, a man yelling, then a woman. Then, a splash, then silence. Didn't think much of it until they never came back. "Did you tell the police?" "They said I was half asleep, old, confused." Mara sat in stunned silence. A splash, a man yelling. That had never made it into any report. She left with her mind racing. The Hartleys' disappearance wasn't an accident. She returned to her motel and spread out the timeline again. Echo Pines, the Rainers, the coordinates, the shack. And then she remembered something else. A hushed conversation between her brother and a stranger, back in the week before the trip. She'd been in the kitchen, half listening. They'd been arguing, something about territory, fishing spots, access. Back then she'd brushed it off. Now it felt like a fracture line running beneath the entire case. She searched online for any past disputes at the lake. A few mentions in local forums. Nothing official. But one stood out. An anonymous post from 2009 on a forgotten message board. "Echo Pines ain't just for fishing. Keep to your side or it'll go bad for you. Ask the ones who vanished." The post was quickly deleted. The account deactivated. But someone had left a digital ghost. Her phone rang. It was Sheriff Lorne, retired but still keeping tabs on the reopened file. "I've been thinking about the Rainers," he said. "They had a second boat. Small, unregistered, never logged it with the station. No records after they left." Mara's voice dropped. "Why didn't you say anything before?" "No proof, and no one wanted to keep looking. Town wanted it buried." Mara stared at the motel ceiling. Buried, just like the boat. She made a decision. That evening, she drove out to the Rainers' old campsite, now a tangle of weeds and rusted fire pits. At the edge of the water, under an overhang, she spotted something. An old cleat bolt drilled into the rock, almost invisible now under grime. It had once held a boat line. "Why here?" She snapped photos. The past wasn't just whispering anymore. It was screaming. And with each step forward, Mara felt the line blur between grief and fury, between seeking answers and demanding justice. She looked out across the lake, wind tugging at her jacket, and whispered into the cold. "I'm not stopping." The rain came fast that night, hammering the metal roof of the motel like fists demanding entry. Mara lay awake in bed, her eyes wide, the thunder outside no louder. Then the noise in her head. Images repeated in loops. The hollow boat pulled from the mud, the small life jackets, the frantic carving in the shack floor, and the names scrawled in Daniel's notebook. But it was the sound that stayed with her, the imagined gasp of her niece underwater, the metallic creak of a boat pushed down by force, the silence that followed. She reached for the nightstand and pulled open the drawer. Inside was her brother's old wristwatch, what was left of it. found 2 days earlier during a second dive into the boat's remains, wedged beneath a seat. Bent and rusted, but unmistakable. He wore it every day since college. She had gifted it to him. He never took it off. Its presence told her one thing: Daniel hadn't left that boat alive. The next morning, she stormed into the sheriff's office, slamming the watch onto his desk. "You told me you found nothing personal," she snapped. "And this? This doesn't count?" Sheriff Lorne looked up, visibly older than the last time they spoke, his hands slightly trembling. "It was, buried in the debris. We weren't sure until the lab confirmed." "Don't lie to me," she said, voice cracking. "You didn't want this case open again." He didn't deny it. Mara left without another word. Her emotions began to spiral. She stopped eating, barely slept. Her notebook filled with erratic scribbles. Rainer, bullet, boat, witness, GPS. But the more she pieced together, the more the truth felt like water slipping through her fingers. She began to hallucinate while walking the lakeshore, hearing Daniel call her name, seeing a child's shoe bob in the current that wasn't really there. One night, desperate for answers, she broke into the locked archives at the old ranger station. Dusty boxes, mildew-dampened case files, and undeveloped rolls of film. Among them, she found a single photograph, one the sheriff had filed as unimportant. It showed the Rainer's boat docked, but not at the public marina. It was tethered to a rocky inlet, the same spot where Daniel's boat was found. The timestamp was clear, July 12, 1997, the day before the Hartleys vanished. She stared at the photo for an hour. They were there. She knew what she had to do. 2 days later, Mara confronted the Rainers in Clearwater, Missouri. She waited outside their home, watching Linda step out with groceries. Her hands trembled. Her pulse raced, but she forced herself forward. "You remember Echo Pines?" Linda froze. The bags dropped. Her eyes went wide. "You remember Daniel Hartley?" Mara pressed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Linda whispered, already retreating toward the house. "I have photos, GPS logs, and a bullet casing. One more test and it'll all match." "You think this is still buried?" The door slammed before she could finish. But Mara saw it just for a second in Linda's face. Fear, guilt,
recognition.
Later that evening, a local detective called Mara. The Rainers had lawyered up, but something was shifting. Authorities reopened the case as a probable homicide. Forensics fast-tracked the analysis of the bullet casing she'd found near the shack. Mara sat alone on the motel porch, knees tucked to her chest. She'd finally shaken the town awake, but she wasn't sure she could hold herself together much longer. The morning was cold and silent as Mara hiked through the dense pine trail, her boots crunching over frost-laced moss. The GPS device in her hand blinked steadily, guiding her deeper into the woods. These coordinates weren't just numbers scribbled in a notebook anymore. They were her last shot at the full truth. She reached the ridge Daniel had once marked with an X beside the phrase, "If anything happens." Below it, hidden behind a deadfall and years of overgrowth, was a shallow depression in the ground, a disturbed patch of soil that looked too clean, too square. Mara knelt, hands trembling, and began to dig with a camp shovel. It didn't take long. 6 inches down, her finger struck cold metal. It was an old Coleman cooler, rusted at the hinges. She pried it open. Inside, wrapped in a torn canvas jacket, were 3 things. Daniel's compass, the same one he carried on every trip since they were kids. A faded Polaroid of his children, smiling beside the lake. And at the bottom, a single spent bullet casing. She stared at it in disbelief. Not just any casing. Stamped 38R, just like the type registered to the Rainer family's revolver in the old sheriff's log. She photographed everything, bagged it, called Detective Rowan back in town. When she handed over the casing, she could barely speak. 3 days later, the lab confirmed it. The casing was a match. That same evening, the Rainers were taken into custody. At first, they denied everything. Said they were being harassed, framed. But after 6 hours of questioning, and when shown the photo of their boat docked at the inlet the day before the disappearance, Linda broke. The confession spilled out between sobs. It had started as a boating accident, a collision in the fog. Daniel had yelled. Linda's husband, Roger, had panicked. A fight broke out. Tempers flared. The Hartley family's boat capsized. Daniel hit his head on the railing. The children screamed. It all happened so fast. Roger told Linda they had to fix it before anyone found out. They loaded what they could into their truck, tied weights to the aluminum boat, sailed it out at night, and let it sink in the deepest cove. buried the rest near the trail, disappeared a week later, and never spoke of it again. Linda wept through the entire testimony. Roger remained silent. Mara sat in the observation room, stone-faced. It wasn't the clarity she had imagined. No grand twist, just fear, cowardice, a chain of choices that ended lives. Still, the truth was out. She walked outside into the crisp air and looked up at the sky. Gray clouds were breaking, light pushing through. After 13 years, the weight she carried wasn't gone, but it had shifted. The lake had kept its secret for over a decade, but it could not hold it forever. The lake looked different now. Echo pines, once silent and evasive, now shimmered under a pale sun. The waterline still bore scars from the drought, deep cracks in the shoreline, mud-caked stones, and exposed roots like veins of a long-forgotten memory. Mara stood at the edge of the dock, the very one where her brother's truck had been found all those years ago. The same truck still sat in a police impound, weathered by time, a relic of the day everything stopped. In her hands, she held the Polaroid. The children's faces were faded but recognizable. Wide eyes, wind-tossed hair, that effortless joy that came with childhood summers. Her brother had taken the photo the morning they left, just before boarding the boat. She tucked it gently into a small glass frame and placed it on the edge of a newly installed wooden bench. Behind her, workers were finishing the last touches on the memorial site. A bronze plaque had been embedded in a stone base nearby. In memory of the Hartley family, Daniel, Elise, Clara, and Joel, lost but never forgotten. A few townspeople gathered quietly. Some Mara remembered, others were strangers to her now. They brought flowers, stood in silence, heads bowed. The Rayners' confession had stunned the town. The couple who once ran the bait shop, now exposed as the architects of a long-buried lie. The sheriff, now fully retired, stood at a distance, hat in hand. He gave Mara a slight nod. She returned it, nothing more. A former classmate approached her hesitantly. "I should have said something," he murmured. "Back then. I heard rumors. I didn't want to get involved." Mara didn't respond with anger. She simply said, "You weren't the only one." As the memorial concluded, she walked alone down to the shallow cove where the boat had been found. The mud had dried, the wreckage removed, but the shape was still visible, an outline of absence. She knelt down and whispered a name. Sharpina, Joel, then another, Clara, and then Elise, Daniel. The wind carried her voice across the water, soft and steady. She opened a small pouch and scattered dried lilies into the lake, one by one. "They deserved better," she whispered. Then she stood, brushed off her hands, and walked back to the dock. People were dispersing now, quietly, respectfully. Some offered words of support, others simply nodded. Mara felt their eyes on her, not with pity, but with a kind of reverence. She had unearthed what the town had buried, not just the crime, but their collective silence. And she had done it without violence, without vengeance, just persistence. That night, back at her cabin, Mara placed the framed Polaroid on her mantle. The watch, the compass, and the GPS notebook joined it. Not trophies, but testimonies. They weren't gone, not completely, not anymore. The cabin was quiet again. Mara sat curled on the worn armchair by the window, a wool blanket around her shoulders, and a steaming mug of chamomile tea resting in her palms. Outside, the wind played softly through the trees, shifting pine needles like old fingers turning the pages of a book long unread. The silence was no longer hostile, it was earned. Her eyes drifted toward the mantel, where 4 items rested in a solemn row. The cracked Polaroid, the compass her brother always carried, the leather-bound GPS notebook, and the wristwatch, its band still stained with time and mud. They weren't trophies. They weren't even really answers. They were remnants, survivors of silence, symbols of people who had deserved to be remembered in the light, not forgotten in the dark. Next to them was something new, a candle flickering gently in a frosted glass holder engraved with the names of the Hartley family. It had been a gift from the town council after the memorial ceremony, a gesture of closure, maybe even apology. Mara reached for the pamphlet on her desk, creased now, corners folded from nervous hands thumbing through it again and again. North County Alliance for the Missing. Volunteer Orientation, July 3rd. She had sent them an email days ago. "We're grateful to have someone who truly understands what it means to carry the unanswered. The weight of not knowing, She had carried it for 13 years. Every single day, woven into her skin, embedded in the pause between breaths. What happened to Daniel? Elise? The kids? Were they scared? Did they cry out? Had they suffered? Now she knew. And knowing was its own sorrow. But it was also freedom. That evening, Mara drove to the lake one last time. Not to search, not to mourn, but simply to be. The golden hour cast its final warmth across the water as she pulled into the gravel lot near the inlet. The lake, once stingy with its truths, now shimmered openly under a clean sky. The new memorial stood a few yards away, but she didn't walk to it. Instead, she brought out the kayak, the same one her brother had gifted her when she turned 18. She hadn't paddled in over a decade, but her hands remembered. With practice quiet, she pushed off from shore and drifted into the water. The lake opened before her like a story finished at last. Painful, yes, but no longer incomplete. She let the paddle rest across her lap, closed her eyes, and breathed. A loon called in the distance. Somewhere behind her, the forest rustled as evening birds stirred. But in the center of it all, there was peace. "We bury things hoping they'll stay gone," she whispered. "But the lake, it remembers." It had remembered the boat. It had remembered the voices that once echoed across its surface. And it had remembered her, the sister who never stopped asking. She opened her eyes and looked toward the far shoreline. For the first time in years, she didn't see a place of endings. She saw a beginning. Because even when the past haunts you, you can still paddle forward. One stroke at a time. Weeks passed. The lake grew quiet again. Tourists returned, and the town's life hummed on. But something had shifted, not in the world, but inside Mara. She no longer looked over her shoulder expecting ghosts. She no longer woke from dreams filled with water and silence. One evening, while organizing the box of old case files, she found a letter she'd forgotten. It was a birthday card Daniel had written to her, never mailed. Just a simple line. "You're stronger than you think. Always have been." She read it 3 times, and then she smiled. Closure doesn't mean forgetting. It means forgiving the world for not having better answers. It means making peace with the fact that you kept going even when everything in you wanted to stop. Mara took that letter, framed it, and placed it beside the Polaroid. Some days she still cried, but most days she lived. And somewhere deep beneath Echo Pines Lake, where mud once buried secrets and silence ruled the water, peace settled in, at last.